Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. What's going on, Lance?
What is going on, Tim? How's everything going in your world today?
Everything is just fine, Lance, and even better that we get to bring our lovely audience a fun chat with a friend of ours, a guy that we really respect and admire, someone who we worked on a television show with, namely Oxygen's The Disappearance of Maura Murray. It's none other than Art Roderick.
Art Roderick, former US Marshal. He is a current contributor to CNN when they need him to chime in when anything significant happens in the world, especially crime-related. He always brings a professional opinion, and as professional as he is, it's really fun to see him sitting back in his Cape Cod abode and just sort of, undoing the top button for us, just loosening the collar with us, and talking about a case that he's passionate about, the Lady of the Dunes, who was discovered on July 26, 1974, in Provinectown on the Cape. It's the very end of Cape Cod in the Race Point Dunes, I believe that's where she was discovered, and it's close to him because his father was the deputy sheriff of Barnstable County at the time, and he heard a lot about that in the Roderick household.
Yeah, what a cool opportunity for us to get to talk to Art and for him to share his personal experiences with this case and as much info as he could, with the case file being closed. And he even mentions that they didn't open it even for him. I mean, what do you got to do if they're not opening it for him?
Right? You'd think that Art Roderick, of all people, could just walk up to them and say, "I'm Art Roderick. Give me the keys to the file.
Hey, here's a US Marshal pen. Give me those
Here's
files.
a US Marshal pen." Yeah. No, he would never do that because he does not hand those things out like candy. He is not very, he's very particular who he gives his US Marshal pins out to. And that was a bombshell. I'll say that was a bombshell. I didn't think he was going to disclose as much as he did in regards to our personal relationship.
Right. The first bombshell of the night comes about 15 minutes into the interview where there's still some confusion, I would say, on exactly how many, if any, pins, U.S. Marshal pins, he's given Lance, because now on these Stitcher Creator commentaries that we've done for Missing Maura Murray, I believe that's where it started, where you started speaking about how many pins Art has given you. Yeah,
well, I think that there was a little bit of confusion on your part when we first started talking about it, but he quickly cleared that up.
Yeah.
I would say there's the only confusion left is how many he's given me, which he's lost count of, which he says. Pretty straightforward with that information. Pretty forthcoming, with that information. He says it's more than we can count, and it's almost as if I'm just making them in my garage, which I take that as a personal. I take that as a personal compliment.
So you can probably see where that goes. And this is recorded on Thursday night on GetVokl. So as you kind of mentioned, Lance, things get a little bit looser on GetVokl. So make sure to join us 9 p.m. Thursday nights, 9 p.m. Eastern. And that does stream right to our Twitter pages, our Facebook, and YouTube. But the best way to interact is on GetVokl.com directly. That's Vokl, VOKL. So join us this Thursday because we're having Patrick Hines from True Crime Obsessed on.
What a delight that's going to be. It's really cool to be on GetVokl and see that chat room growing and growing every week. So we love the platform. We don't get any kickbacks or anything from that. Just to be clear, we just really love the platform. They have figured out the way to integrate with Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and like you said, the interaction on GetVokl itself is really where it's at. So sign up, super easy to do, and join the conversation. You're going to want to join with Patrick Hines because we've been dying to get together with him. We had a live show that was booked for March, and then we rescheduled to August, and now it's sort of postponed indefinitely until this COVID-19 is cleared up and people feel safe to go back out again. So stay tuned for when we're going to be having our live shows with True Crime Obsessed, Boston and Philadelphia. But in the meantime, we're going to give you a GetVokl with him.
Yes.
Just to, quench the thirst a bit.
And the GetVokl audio is what we use for Art, and it's pretty good. It sounds pretty good, but there is in the very beginning where Art's talking, it's a little kind of crinkly, and then it kind of sounds like we interrupt him several times, but that's actually kind of a little technical issue that we sort of jump him by a word or two on some sentences. So bear with us on that, but the rest of it sounds really good.
And just know we would never, ever interrupt Art Roderick.
And there's about 25 minutes that we left out of this, and it gets a little bit looser. And in fact, Chris Jewett of Criminal Perspective, another great show on the Crawlspace Media Network, joins us to talk to Art. And so that is going to be on our Patreon page. You can get it there at patreon.com/crawlspacepodcast. Thanks for listening. Follow us on social media and check out the website, crawlspace-media.com. We are here to talk primarily about The Lady of the Dunes, which is a mystery deep-seated in Cape Cod lore. And it's something that's very close to you.
It is. The Lady of the Dunes was actually found in Provinectown, the very tip of Cape Cod, or P-Town. Raised up there. Both sides of my family, generationally, are from there. Obviously I have a lot of aunts, uncles, cousins down there, still to this day. And the town is near and dear to my heart. And I went back in probably 2004, and it was a beautiful June day, and I said, boy, I miss this place. There's nothing like Cape Cod when the skies are clear and the sun's out. It's the bluest of blue skies, and of course, Provincetown, a very beautiful little town, and luckily they have kept it that way. Okay,
and how far back does law enforcement go in your family? Because we've talked about your history. My actual question is, are members of the Roderick family on the poster behind you?
No, they're not. The poster behind me is a historical poster from like 1989 that celebrated our 200th anniversary of the US Marshals, which were brought about in 1789. So we put out a series of posters back in 1989 to commemorate the bicentennial. And this is just one of the posters, and it's got several old badges and pictures of marshals back from the 1800s. So it's more of a commemorative piece than anything to do with my family.
But your family is pretty steeped in law enforcement, and when the case came about, the Lady of the Dunes, that happened July 26, 1974, you have memory of your father discussing this case.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was 18 years old, and I was commercial fishing with one of my father's brothers at the time on an Eastern dragger, 75-foot Eastern dragger called the Jimmy Boy. And July 26, 1974 was a Friday. So that's the only day we don't go fishing because the market's closed that day. And I specifically remember when this all came about, my father was one of the first criminal investigators in the Army back in World War II. He fought in World War II in the Pacific Theater and became an MP or a criminal investigator afterwards, and was stationed for many years in Japan, helping the Japanese establish a civil police force. He retired in 1962, came back to Provincetown and was actually on the Provincetown Police Department for a couple of years, and then became a deputy sheriff in Barnstable County. And he worked out of the Orleans courthouse, which is the second district court here on Cape Cod. But he was also the bailiff in Provincetown. So if anybody got any trouble, you would see my father to get out of jail and then show up for your approved time at court. But my father was in law enforcement for many, many years. My wife's a US Marshal. My sister's a DEA agent. I also have a sister-in-law who's an FBI agent. So, and some cousins along the line that also are in law enforcement. So my family was either commercial fishermen or law enforcement officers.
So I can imagine that the conversation around the Thanksgiving table probably had a lot of football going on, a lot of football topics.
A lot of topics going on, let me tell you. And obviously with all the events that have occurred here recently, we've had many conversations about what's going on today in the United States.
Well, that's interesting. Actually, we have Pi Rational there. She said the family reunions must be amazing. How does that, when you do get together with your family, and you just mentioned all of the going-ons today, and do you expect when you get together with your family and you have different generations talking, is everybody kind of coming from a different point of view, or do you all have, I guess, sort of the same point of view, and you're just saying, well, this is how we adapt to these times?
And can we raffle off an invite?
Now that would be interesting because we do check our guns at the doors. No, I'm only.
No, you don't check your guns at all.
Yeah. I think it's like any other family. You come from a large family, and everybody has varying different points of view. So although we have a lot of law enforcement people in the family, we have a lot of people that aren't, and I've got, sisters that are involved in public service, nursing and school teachers, and, other family members that are involved in public service. So we sort of all have that kind of view on life as my dad did and my mother did regarding public service and community service.
That's so cool that you regard it as public service and community service and not specifically law enforcement.
No, it's community service. I mean, you're there to do a job, and I always say it's, and I think a lot of people will agree, it's the hardest job, I think, going, because you have to emotionally, as a uniformed police officer. Now, I did do 3 years as a local police officer here on the Cape, but mainly I spent my marshal career looking for bad guys, which to me is a lot easier than driving around in a community in a police car and in a uniform. But it is community service. It is what we're there for. And I think we got away from that maybe a decade ago, and I think we're starting to come back to more community policing and more contact with the community between law enforcement and the community, and letting each other know exactly, how we feel, how the community feels. So, even though a lot of this is going on pretty bad right now, it's horrible situation going on. I think it has gotten better over the past decade.
You said something interesting, that it's easier, and maybe I misheard you. You said it's easier to be the guy who's catching the bad guys as opposed to being in uniform driving through the communities.
Well, from the perspective of, when I'm looking for a fugitive, I know what I'm looking for. I know what I'm going after. A police officer in uniform doesn't really know, if they pull somebody over for speeding, exactly who they have in that car. I can't tell you how many times major criminals have been caught because they've run a stop sign or they've run through a traffic light. So being a police officer, you're basically you've got a target on your back in one form or another, and you never know what you're walking into. At least as a marshal, when you're going after bad guys, you kind of know it's dangerous right up front. So you're going to be ready for just about anything. Whereas a police officer, you really don't know what you're walking into.
Well, Art, we are all very impressed with your background, but none more than Lance. And Lance has been talking lately a lot about the US Marshal pins that you've given him, the handful of them. So I just wanted to confirm how many pins you've given Lance.
I'll just before you.
I have no idea. He must be making them. He's making them in his basement.
No,
That's what he's
stop
doing
it.
now.
Stop it. Now, we've been talking about this. There's photographic evidence of you giving me a pen when we were hiking Mount Kerrigan. Yeah. Tim is in front of
Never
us.
happened.
You're clearly giving me a pin. You have tears in your eyes because it was so emotional for you. And I
Well, the tears didn't have anything to do with emotion. As you recall, that hike was pretty treacherous.
but we got through it together. After you gave me that pin on the hike, we got through it together.
Yeah, there was a
Yes,
bond
yeah.
formed at that moment. I feel like
It was great. It was great. I was gonna wear all of them tonight, but I didn't want to embarrass. I didn't want to embarrass you or
or me, because I haven't gotten any.
or Tim mostly. Yeah.
Right, I didn't get one on the top of Mount Carrigan. So, but
Yours is in the mail. Tim.
Well, I'm glad we finally cleared that up because Tim
Yeah.
didn't believe me.
I feel like we didn't clear anything up,
I think,
actually.
I think it's very clear now. All right, Lady of the Dunes.
Okay, so the Lady of the Dunes was found on July 26, 1974 by a 12-year-old young girl named Leslie Metcalf. She was walking with her parents through Race Point Beach in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And so this is a Jane Doe. She's never been identified. She's been sort of dubbed that name.
Yeah, and it's it probably, this case has always kind of been around for others, probably a lot more than me. But when I came back after I retired and came back to the case, it kind of came back to the Cape. It kind of popped up again, and I was thinking to myself, geez, we haven't done anything on this. Law enforcement hasn't done anything on this case. So I started checking into it, and I found actually they've done quite a bit on this case. In Massachusetts, it's kind of unique or unusual. I was a police officer here on Cape Cod, and anytime we had any type of crime that needed crime scene technicians, the PDs down here are not big enough to have those type of expertise. So we would call the county sheriffs who had crime scene technicians that would come into town, take photographs, take latent prints, whatever was needed based on the particular crime. And that's what's happened here. Provincetown Police Department is a small PD. Detective Meredith Lober has the case currently, but it is actually under the investigative jurisdiction of the Mass State Police, which are under District Attorney O'Keefe here in Barnstable County. So the DA actually monitors and sort of manages these homicide cases with the Mass State Police task force assigned to that district attorney actually doing the investigation.
And where does this investigation stand now? Because you said that you went down there and you were.
Well, I mean, obviously over the years, this case has garnered a ton of publicity. There's been news reports, magazine articles, newspaper articles, TV shows. A lot of press reports pop up every so often. And there was a flurry over the past couple of years of news reports concerning the case and a lot of sort of urban myths about what this case is all about. But the bottom line, as you had stated, Leslie Metcalf found the Lady of the Dunes on that day, July 26 in 74. She was actually out with her parents and some other friends who had a dog. The dog was rustling around in a particular area. She went over and actually discovered the body, which was laying face down on a green towel with the jeans kind of folded under her head. She was almost decapitated. That's how badly her throat was cut. And then her hands had been cut off and removed, and there was pine needles in the area where her hands should have been. And she was decomposed. I mean, you're talking July on the Cape. It gets pretty warm there in the days, but the ME sort of established the time of death 10 days to 3 weeks prior to July 26th.
When you said that she had pine needles where her hands used to be, that's because her hands were amputated. Was it some sort of like, did it strike anybody as being like a ceremonial type thing or like a...
It's hard to say because that's the description we have, but this was 1974. The chief that originally had the case, Chief Jimmy Meads, was a good friend of my father and of my family. He has since passed away. Warren Tobias, who I actually played high school football with, was a detective with the Provinectown PD. He actually picked the case up, and now Detective Meredith Lober, has the case currently. Now they're sort of monitoring it and working with the state police. So a lot of things have been done over the years. There's been a lot of speculation come out as to who she is, what she is. I mean, apparently she had some major dental work done in the area of thousands of dollars worth of gold work in her mouth. Now, several of her teeth were missing.
Mm-hmm.
So it appeared that somebody was trying to hide her identity. We got no fingerprints here. Some of the teeth were removed, so dental records are a little more difficult. But, a lot of things have happened over the years, a lot of speculation as to who possibly could have done that and where and who this woman actually is.
Yeah, I just want to point out the geography of Provincetown, specifically on the Cape. If you don't know Massachusetts well, that's quite a hike from Boston. That's like what's that, like a 2.5 hour drive from Boston? Like it's
about 2.5 hour drive from Boston. They have the ferry that goes across from Boston to P-Town in the summertime. But it's a haul.
So, and you could drive the entire length of Massachusetts in about 3 hours, east to west. So it's, geographically speaking, the distance from Boston to Provincetown isn't great. It isn't that. It shouldn't represent 2.5 hours.
Right. You're saying the mileage between the two. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're talking small highways. You're talking 13 miles of what we call Suicide Alley down here that goes to the Orleans Rotary. And then, from there on, it's a slow speed limit. So that adds to that whole timing. And plus, in the summertime, if you can do 2.5 hours from P-Town to Boston,
Right. So
there's no random killer that just happens to be in P-Town, the way a random killer could happen to be in the middle of the state, unless they'd been there for a little while, or maybe there was like drug activity, or
there have been random killings down there. They don't occur very often at all. But, probably 7 years prior to this, you had Anton Costa, who was a serial killer who killed several women down there, but he was from P-Town. And you've had other homicides down there. I remember my father working as a court officer. He had to go, a lot of times they took juries out to murder scenes, and, he would be the court representative there, making sure the jury wasn't molested or talked to or anything like that. And he used to do that quite a bit. I mean, it's rare, but it does happen down here. And we've had serial killers in this area, not only Anton Costa, but Hayden Clark, another prolific serial killer. We've had other criminals that come down here. Whitey Bulger has been implicated in this particular homicide. Of course, he apparently took that to his grave, whether it's a yes or a no. But he denied any involvement in this particular homicide.
Kind of his signature, right? The removal of the teeth, the removal of anything that would be like a distinguishing characteristic, distinguishing feature.
Exactly, and the thing that kind of adds to it is the initial reports indicate there was no sexual assault. So it wasn't like some type of sex crime or some sex crime that got out of control and they ended up doing that. I mean, you don't cut somebody's hands off like that unless you want to possibly hide their identity.
Before it goes unnoticed, and I just want to, remind myself on it. Shannon said that detail about the jeans weirds me out every time. What's the detail about the jeans?
Well, the jeans were apparently folded like a pillow.
Right.
Either under her head or right next to her body. So it appears, when you talk about individuals that try to make somebody comfortable after they're dead, or try to assume that, hey, I'm going to make this person comfortable. Usually there's some connection between that individual and the victim. And usually they play on that. The problem is it's very hard to investigate, almost impossible to investigate this particular crime or any crime where you don't have the identity of the victim.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And what is what we know about the victim? Tell us about her, I guess.
She was, like I had mentioned, dead 10 days to 3 weeks. She's between the age of 25 and 39. She's about 5 feet 6 inches tall. She had an athletic physique, auburn hair. And another thing that was mentioned was that the blanket that she was laying on, or the towel that she was laying on, was undisturbed. So, you can draw whatever conclusion you want from that. But there was some blood in the area. There was some tire tracks, and there was some footprints. Unfortunately, when you think back to a case to 1974, the evidence room for the state police and for the PD had been moved a couple times. And unfortunately, it appears what I'm hearing is that all that evidence is lost.
What?
I thought you were about to say all the evidence from 1974 after a couple of moves was securely kept in a airtight room. And no,
unfortunately.
Damn.
Unfortunately, I mean, you do the best you can. Cold cases, I think everybody's watched enough cold case shows to realize that, when you see a detective go get a cold case, where's he go? In the basement? Usually an old ratted box, and starts pulling out boxes. And a lot of times when you move headquarters, you move evidence rooms, you move this, stuff gets either archived and gets lost, or it just gets tossed, unfortunately. And that appears to be the case here. Now, they do have remains. In fact, the remains are interred in St. Peter's Cemetery in Provinectown, where all my family, all my relatives are also interred. Obviously, those that have passed are interred there at St. Peter's Cemetery also. And that's where her remains
so
are.
what is stopping someone from exhuming the body and performing DNA testing on it?
Well, the body's been exhumed
Right.
like twice already. As we've moved through the decades and DNA has gotten better, the body's been exhumed twice. And I think probably when we started talking about this case a year, 2 years ago, I myself had a conversation with the district attorney and talked to the Mass State Police, and started going over different scenarios that we could do, specifically with some of the stuff I had done on the Alcatraz escape case involving DNA. And I think that probably has been done over the past year and a half. Now, the problem is what's left is not much. It's just bones, and they're not all the bones. Some of them have already been removed for DNA testing over the past couple decades. They do have a DNA profile. And I think probably over this past year, they have tried to do another DNA genealogical type DNA profile. And we're not exactly sure where that is right now. The district attorney's office and the Mass State Police, of course, aren't going to share that openly.
No,
With me or with
why
us.
not with you? You can't just walk in there and say,
Hey,
It's Art.
look at the pin. It's Art. It's Art Roderick.
Yeah, I know a lot of the state troopers, and the district attorney actually was a police officer in the town right next to where I was a police officer, and he knows my father. But can I walk in there and demand to see a
yes.
case file? No. I mean, this is an open homicide case, basically. So they're just not going to open the case files, especially now when they might be onto something good. I mean, for all we know, they could have done this genealogy charting and figured out
Let
what's
this
going
be
on.
a message to people.
Who are, the citizen detectives. We do appreciate the work that I say we, like I'm a US Marshal too. I'm like an honorary one anyway.
Yeah, I mean, at least.
At least an honorary
Yeah.
one. But you hear this over and over, that people will submit evidence or what they think is evidence, or they'll submit a lead to law enforcement, and then they don't understand why no one got back to them to tell them where that lead ended up or what became of that lead. Art Roderick, who literally has been born into law enforcement and was in the US Marshal. division. I mean, you were part of Homeland Security as well. I mean, your resume is extensive. Not even you can say, listen, just cut me some slack. I need to know this. Those are the rules, and not even you can be one to break those rules. Oh yeah, sorry, Shannon, and dashing in that jacket. Shannon just wanted to add that.
Yeah, what if you wore that jacket into the police station? I feel like
No, I don't think wearing any type of jacket's going to make any difference. And I'll tell you, I worked at CNN for 3.5 years and did the talking head thing with them. And I always used to tell the anchors or the public, hey, listen, when law enforcement is quiet and they're not providing a ton of information, then generally they're working on something fairly decent, and they don't want to blow the lead by putting it out there. There's always a public safety issue that law enforcement looks at. And in this particular case, we're talking a case from 1974 that every couple of years seems to generate a lot of press and a lot of interest. We had the Joe Hill thing.
yes, people in the chat room are dying to hear about that. This is where Joe Hill, Stephen King's son, claims that he recognized Lady of the Dune in Jaws.
Yes, and it's interesting because that was all going on around the same time. As you recall, the first Jaws movie was being filmed around 74, and obviously this body was found in 74, and he actually went through and looked and picked a woman out that kind of looks like the composite that has been done, that has been out there in the press, and tagged this particular female as possibly the Lady of the Dunes. And it generated a lot of press. Unfortunately, I think from the fortunate side, it's always good to keep these cases open in the press, and whatever can generate any type of lead is good. But in this particular case, that lady is alive and well and living in the vineyard. She's a local resident over in Martha's Vineyard. She saw this photo and actually let law enforcement know that she's alive and she's not the lady.
So she called them?
Yes, they were able to make I'm not sure if she called them or law enforcement was able to figure out who it was, but let's just say that they were able to track that woman that Joe Hill said was possibly Lady of the Dunes from Jaws back to her home in the vineyard.
Well, we just dropped an exclusive here on GetVokl. Shannon didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, there was I don't know if it was newer, but there was another composite, a facial reconstruction of Lady of the Dunes done with and without freckles in 2010, and that facial reconstruction doesn't really look like that Jaws extra, whereas the other one kind of did. That composite did. Yeah, I wonder which one's closer. The second one seems to have more of red hair.
I think that one is a 3D rendering, a 3D composite. I mean, there are always questions because it's not 100% science. Obviously, they're working off, dimensions on faces and symmetry and all that stuff. And then they have software programs out there that can do that now and age people. But, one of the interesting things I've come across is that, and we've talked about Parabon Nanolabs before out of Reston, Virginia, but apparently they have the capability of something called Snapshot, which if they have a large enough DNA profile, they are able to actually do a composite of what an individual looked like at age 25. I mean, height, weight, hair color, eye color, freckles, no freckles. It's amazing what they can do. The only thing they can't do is the weight issue because it fluctuates so much over the years. So, Parabon Nanolabs is able to do that, and I think they've actually copyrighted that particular capability and called it Snapshot.
I would love to know what it was like in the Roderick household when you first heard about this and you heard your father talking about this. You said that you found out about it when you were on a fishing boat, but what was it like hearing details? Did you hear details as an 18-year-old? And were you shocked? Was this the first time you heard something like that?
No, because I was around when Anton Costa was killing women in Truro and in Provincetown. So I heard my father talk about a lot of stuff that he was doing at the courthouse. But of course, I'm 18 years old, and it's a Friday, so the fish market's closed. But I have to get ready to go out fishing at 2 a.m. in the morning and not come back for 3 days. So, okay, just another story. Somebody's found dead on the Cape. Interesting. But I never thought it would ever take on this type of, we're now talking about it in 2020 from when I was 18 in 1974.
Yeah, for sure. And every time you go back there, because you split your time between your work in D.C. and your home life on the Cape, when you go back there, you must be reminded every time you cross over into, through like over what's the bridge, the Bourne Bridge. How soon as you're entering into the Cape do you start thinking about the Lady of the Dunes?
Usually when I'm going right into town and I can see the monument, the Pilgrim Monument from the highway, I start thinking about it. But, it's one of those cases where I was never involved. I've never read the case files. I know probably maybe a little more than what the average person would know, that beyond what the press has reported and what I've researched. But other than that, I mean, this to me simply comes down to, you got to figure out who she is before you can solve the homicide. So how do you figure out who she is? You got to do the DNA, you got to do the genealogy, and I'm fairly sure that the state police are working on that stuff right
And
now.
you're
Working with anybody in particular on this independently?
okay.
No.
So you are.
No, not really.
Bombshell? Another bombshell here?
No.
You're about to make an arrest.
No, hey, there's going to be two parts to this thing. And the biggest part right now is figuring out who she is. Once that's done, that's a huge leap. I mean, that's a light year leap ahead of where they've ever been since 1974. Once they figure out who she is, then the real investigation begins into, who did she have contact with, what she was doing, what's her family, how come nobody's reported her missing? I would say, was she sex trafficked? Was she smuggled, human smuggled? But she's got a lot of really high-end
Right. What does that tell you?
done. Well, it leads you to believe she had some money, and that either she had some money or somebody she was with.
It's just such a weird place to end up if you are as a body to be dumped, like there's one way in and one way out, you can't just keep going. So that's such a weird clue to me.
And it's also those beaches, Race Point, Herring Cove Beach, that whole area is Provincetown is mostly, other than the town itself, is mostly national seashore. So it's all federal land, and but it's very well traversed. So somebody was going to find that body, and it's July.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that. This is just a couple of weeks after the 4th of July, which I imagine is a huge time of the year for Provincetown. How does one get away with doing all of that to a human being in one of the most public places in the state at that time?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. We don't know where she came from. We don't know where she was prior to her body being found. So, was she in town? If she was in town in Provincetown in July, there's tens of thousands of people there, and it's a small town. You can mix in and get lost very easily. People are always walking the beaches at night, that's whoever did this, whoever put it there, I'm sure knew that at some point in time soon after.
Right. They didn't try to
found.
bury her. Do you know what her hands were cut off with?
No, I haven't seen the original autopsy report, so I don't know if it was a straight cut or, I didn't see. I don't know how the hands were cut off. Was it done with a saw, with a blade, whatever?
And teeth
I
were
don't know.
removed. This seems somewhat professional to me.
Yes, it does sound
Right.
like.
How do you
that,
remove
yeah.
teeth? Pliers?
Yeah, and she was almost decapitated. So, I don't know if they gave up on that.
Do you think that it might be more than one person?
It could be more than one person, but they have a set of vehicle tracks and a set of footprints. Unfortunately, we're talking about beach sand, so there's probably the tire prints are more distinguishable than the footprints.
Were there a lot of
Vehicles on the beach at the time? Was it a beach that they allowed the vehicles on?
portions of Race Point they did back then? In fact, I used to go out there all the time on four-wheel driving. You get your over the sand permit, and you would go out to where we'd go to the other side of Race Point Light, which used to be called, or it's still called, Hatches Harbor, and we would stay out there, and there'd be, multiple family members out there, and friends and relatives and everything would kind of stake that area of the beach out there. But yeah, there's used to be, at that point in time, a lot of four-wheel drive trails out there.
With the hands being removed, other than not being able to identify the body, is there any theories about why that would be the case? Was there anything, maybe another connective case that you can look at where hands were removed or anything like that?
They've looked, I can tell you investigatively, they've looked at every possible avenue, from serial killers, the two that I've mentioned already. Well, specifically Hayden Clark was looked at for a while. Whitey Bulger was looked at. But I think it comes down to the fact that the theory I've heard is that they believe that the hands being cut off were just an identity issue.
We have Luke here, who also says sounds like a boat prop incident. Has there ever been anything explored with that theory?
Yeah, I think the cuts were too clean, and there would have been other marks, on the body at that point. It wasn't like she was washed up or she was in the water.
Right. Her head, her
the
head was
body
propped with the
placed
jeans
there.
too.
Right, exactly. And there was a bandana nearby also. So it wasn't like she was out in the water and got hurt and then came up on the beach. It was more like she was
Right, and there is some signs of blunt force trauma on her head. Any idea what weapon that was?
No, didn't see anything to indicate any type of weapon. And as I recall, I don't think they actually found a weapon nearby. So, blunt force trauma can be anything from a log to a hammer to a baseball bat. It can be anything you can get your hands on. Tire iron.
And
they've never found the hands.
So
correct.
Could it possibly
Never
be
found
that
the
she
hands.
was maybe murdered on a boat?
And then they threw the hands overboard, and then
Well, they could have thrown them in. They could have cut her hands off and thrown them in the
Right.
water at any given point, and just let the marine life take it over. Or they could have taken them.
Do you think
somewhere
that she was
and
murdered there, or was she placed there? Do you think her body was moved?
It seems like from the blood, and it looks like she was placed. There wasn't a struggle, so it looks like she was placed there. And they say there wasn't a struggle based on the area around the body and the fact that the towel she was lying on, it wasn't really disturbed. So it's hard to say. That's stuff that would be deep in the file, and it would also probably, some of it would also be in the medical examiner report.
Right, because
report.
okay, so she's not killed right there because it didn't look like there was a struggle right there.
And there
But
would have been
there-
blood, significant blood, I think, yeah.
Right. And there was nothing in the file.
Yeah, they also said she could have been sleeping. Was one other theory that
Okay.
came up. I don't know. It's very difficult to say. And again, all that
Yeah.
stuff is gone. So we're not able to do any DNA testing. The state police can't do any DNA testing on the clothing, on any of the stuff that was found at the crime
Has there
scene.
been any significant person of interest?
Other than the few that I've mentioned, there have been others that have come up, but not people I wouldn't say were persons of interest. Persons of interest is a pretty strong term in law enforcement. I mean, it's one step.
Oh, I know what the term means. I'm basically a U.S. Marshal. I know.
Yeah, but I think a lot of people were interviewed. A lot of people were talked to. Even people that came forward and thought possibly she could have been their relatives, or could have been a relative of theirs, and they did some DNA testing and proved not to be. So it's not like this case is sat completely dormant. I mean, law enforcement, both from the Detective Lober side and Detective Tobias from the PD, and also the Mass State Police, they have done a lot of work on this case.
Yeah, that Whitey Bulger connection is pretty interesting. Shannon in the chat room has brought him up a couple times as well, and I'm actually reading the new book Hunting Whitey, which is great. It's about the FBI hunt of Whitey Bulger, and I'm almost done with it. But he actually buried some people in, some of his 19 victims. He buried them on a beach in Dorchester. I think this would be a little early in his ring of murders, but this seems like it was right after he joined the Winter Hill Gang.
He hopefully in that book they gave credit to the U.S. Marshals.
There's a lot of yes, they do, yeah, and there's a lot of U.S. Marshal talk in there.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure. But Whitey also frequented Provinectown quite a bit. Yes. And that's one of the reasons why he was sort of high on the list of people to talk to, but he's denied any involvement in that case. But he used to frequent Provinectown down here during that time frame, I believe.
Weren't his victims, and especially the female victims, weren't they well known because they clearly had some altercation with him, or there was some falling out between relations?
Yeah, no, Whitey's the people that Whitey ended up doing in had some connection to what he was doing, as opposed to some random person on the street.
Yeah, because
I would imagine that if the Lady of the Dunes had any connection to Whitey Bulger, it was because someone that she was associated with was working with him, or she might have been running drugs for him or something, but she would have had something within the, someone in that circle would have known her as well. Without a doubt. I think
I think that would be the meaning of removing the hands and some of the teeth as well. That seems like a professional job. And she seems like she's not, like she might have been his girlfriend or something like that.
Yeah, I would say it has the ring of a professional job, but a professional job also means we wouldn't have found the head. A real professional job. I mean, and Whitey, was a real professional.
Yeah, this is pretty early though. Still, I think.
Yeah, it is early, and I know a lot of these guys, that do this, do perfect, get better at getting away with these types of crimes as they move through their criminal career. But yeah, I agree. I mean, if it's early on, I mean, Whitey's on the list of people, but we'll never know at this point in time.
He rose to his power while you were rising to your law enforcement power.
Yeah,
in the same state.
Yeah, I came across him in a lot of cases, mainly when I was looking for organized crime fugitives in the New England area. Obviously, his name would always pop up, and then the whole issue of Whitey being an informant and basically ratting on the Italian mob, and all that came into play in a lot of cases, in a couple of 2 or 3 cases that I worked in New England dealing with organized crime.
What was that like in your circle of peers talking about this one character, this Whitey Bulger? Was he really as deadly as was he?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, but there's a lot of characters like that, and they were all. I mean, you work cases in Rhode Island back in the day, and you talk about Patriarca. You work cases in Springfield, Massachusetts, and it was Skyball, Scabelli. So the mob guys were always kind of there in the background, and especially with the cases I was working, because they were tied. The two cases that come to mind are Alley Boy Persico and Salvatore Michael Caruana. And Alley Boy Persico was hooked with the Colombo crime family in New York, but was being hit out in Connecticut. Caruana was hooked with the Boston mob. He was being hit in Connecticut. So there's all this connection in New England, New York that was going on at the time to hide these individuals.
And who are you taking direction from as a U.S. Marshal in relation to all of the organized crime? Because I'm assuming that you and your peers would look at something that Whitey did or something that you think Whitey would do, and you want to go form a case or maybe form an investigation against him. Who do you take orders from? And they say, here's your directive. And do you ever bring like ideas to that entity as well?
Oh, absolutely. Very simply, the FBI has jurisdiction over organized crime cases. So the marshals have worked with them in the past. We've come up with information. I mean, when I was working a couple cases in Connecticut, we were able to turn over boxes of info to the FBI that they were able to use to literally break the back of the mob in central New England area. So, yeah, you have to work jointly because although we might have a fugitive that's an organized crime person and is wanted, the FBI might have had the original case. So we do work together and exchange information. It's gotten a lot better, I can tell you, since the 70s and 80s. But that you have to share info. Otherwise, you're losing a whole block of information. And, we don't have a way of actually looking at what a criminal does. If you didn't catch him on Friday, how many crimes did he commit 2 weeks later on that following Friday? So we try to get these individuals in custody as quickly as possible for public safety issues.
Did you ever have any dealings with the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist?
No, but that's another one Whitey's been implicated in. No, I did actually want to do something on that particular case, more of a TV production as opposed to my law enforcement career. But, the Marshal Service is an investigative agency, but really their bread and butter is fugitive cases. So if they had located somebody and had an individual's name, then a lot of the times they'll call us in to actually find these types of individuals. So in that case, they still have no idea, who committed that robbery.
Yeah. Apparently, he says in that same book, or it's in that same book, that he claims he had nothing to do with it. But I haven't gotten to that part yet. The book is great. Once again, I love it. I do.
Okay, so if the U.S. Marshal Service primarily is there to locate fugitives, was there ever a fugitive that you were assigned to locate that made your heart maybe skip a beat, where you thought to yourself, this is going to suck?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of them. I mean, when I had worked in Connecticut in the mid '80s, I got promoted to headquarters and basically ran a bunch of cases out of headquarters in the field. So I'd done a lot of work in Jamaica back in the '80s when the shower posse was huge, down in Miami. And, those individuals would love to kill a cop. They don't care. They've got 20, 30 killings to their name. They're enforcers for all the different posses down there. It's kind of died out a little bit now. At this time, it's become a lot more localized down in down in Jamaica as opposed to here in the US. But yeah, just about every one of them. I mean, unfortunately, since 2011, we've lost, I think, around 9-10 US Marshals doing exactly that, executing arrest warrants, and they've been shot and killed. We've also had several task force officers that are special deputy US Marshals, which are local police officers that we deputize to help us out in these cases, that have been shot and killed while executing arrest warrants. I mean, when you go after, the Marshals average around 100,000 fugitive felony arrests every year. Okay, and that's with all their task forces across the country, and that's domestic and also international. We go after fugitives that are wanted overseas. That are wanted in the U.S. that are overseas, and vice versa. Those that are wanted overseas that come to the U.S., we look for those individuals also. So unfortunately, there's a lot of job security out there for anybody working in the Marshal Service in the fugitive program.